The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Marcus Mitchell's shoes clicked against the stone as he walked through the main entrance, gripping his daughter's small hand tightly. Sarah was dressed in her pink Sunday dress, the one her grandmother had carefully ironed the night before, and her blonde hair was braided in tight, perfect rows. She looked like a porcelain doll, innocent and fragile, which only intensified the weight Marcus felt pressing down on his shoulders. Today wasn't just another day. Today would determine whether he got to keep his daughter or lose her forever. They climbed the stairs to the third floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. Sarah swung her small legs nervously, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She didn't fully understand what was happening, only that something very important and very scary was taking place. Marcus had tried to explain it in 5-year-old terms. We're going to talk to a judge about where you're going to live. But how do you explain custody battles and legal battles to a child? How do you tell them that your family wants to take them away? The answer was simple: you can't. You just hold their hand and try to be brave for them, even when your own world is crumbling. The courthouse corridors were cold and sterile, smelling of floor wax and old wood. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with an almost mocking intensity. As Marcus and Sarah walked toward Courtroom B, his heart began to pound harder. He'd been preparing for this moment for 3 months, 3 months of sleepless nights, expensive lawyers, and emotional turmoil. His attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Rodriguez, had warned him that custody battles were unpredictable. "You never know what a judge will focus on," she'd said during their last meeting. "Be prepared for anything." Marcus was 42 years old, with tired eyes that told the story of 2 years raising a child alone. His dark hair was graying at the temples, a physical manifestation of the stress he'd endured since Jennifer, Sarah's mother, had disappeared. Jennifer had left for work one morning and never came back. No note, no explanation. The police investigated for months but found nothing. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, leaving behind a heartbroken husband and a confused 3-year-old daughter who kept asking where Mommy was. Now, at 5, Sarah barely remembered her mother. Marcus was all she had. His job as a warehouse supervisor demanded long hours, sometimes 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. He worked hard because he had to. Medical bills from Jennifer's disappearance investigation had drained their savings. Lawyers weren't cheap. Daycare wasn't cheap. Single parenthood was expensive in ways he'd never anticipated. But he loved his daughter more than he loved anything in this world. Every paycheck went to her. Every weekend was dedicated to her. Every decision he made considered her well-being. Yet somehow, that wasn't enough. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, wooden and imposing. Marcus took a deep breath and pushed them open. The interior was everything a courtroom should be: imposing, formal, and cold. High ceilings, dark wood paneling. The judge's bench elevated like a throne, American flags on either side. Benches arranged like a church, separating the public from the proceedings. Marcus guided Sarah to one of the front benches and sat down, keeping her pressed against his side. Her small body was trembling slightly. Then he saw them. Sitting on the opposite side was his sister-in-law, Patricia. She was 56 years old, well-dressed, with an expression of cold determination. She'd never been particularly warm to Marcus, but since Jennifer's disappearance, she'd become actively hostile. Next to her sat her husband, David, a successful businessman with slick-back hair and an even colder demeanor. But what really caught Marcus's attention were the 2 lawyers flanking them, expensive lawyers. The kind who wore Italian shoes and carried briefcases that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. These weren't local attorneys. These were hired guns. Patricia had made her intentions clear 3 months ago when she called Marcus on the phone. "Sarah would be better off with us," she'd said coldly. "You work all day. You're barely present in her life. We have space, resources, and stability. We're going to file for custody." Marcus had been shocked. He'd asked if they could discuss it as a family, but Patricia had already hung up. The custody papers arrived a week later, served to him at work like a public execution. The courtroom was beginning to fill with people, court reporters, bailiffs, other attorneys with their own cases scheduled for later. A few journalists slipped into the back benches. Marcus recognized one of them, Rachel Webb from the local news. She'd covered Jennifer's disappearance and had maintained a sympathetic tone toward Marcus. But today she was here as an observer, ready to document this custody case. Sarah squeezed her father's hand. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered, her small voice barely audible. Marcus leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "I know, baby. I'm here. Daddy's not going anywhere." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. What if he lost? What if the judge looked at his financial situation, his long work hours, his single status, and decided Patricia was right? What if judges in America somehow still believed that children needed two parents, that a man alone couldn't adequately raise a daughter? His attorney, Linda, approached and sat down beside them. She wore a navy suit and carried a leather portfolio containing their defense. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "Barely," Marcus admitted. "This is insane. Patricia has no right to Sarah." "I know," Linda said, "but her lawyers will argue that two-parent households provide better stability. They'll focus on your work hours. They'll try to paint a picture of a child being neglected. We need to counter that narrative." She paused. "Sarah will need to be heard in this. Not in a formal way necessarily, but the judge needs to understand her perspective." Sarah looked up at her father with eyes that seemed far too old for her 5 years. She'd already learned that the adults around her were fighting over her like she was a possession to be claimed. It was a burden no child should carry. The bailiff stood and announced, "All rise." The Honorable Judge James Henderson presiding. Judge Henderson entered from behind his bench, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a stern expression. He took his seat and looked down at the courtroom below, his gaze settling for a moment on Sarah. Then he opened his file and began reviewing the documentation in front of him. Marcus felt Sarah lean against him. He wrapped his arm around her protectively, even though he couldn't protect her from what was coming. The moment of truth was here. Everything they'd built together, the small apartment, the bedtime stories, the Saturday morning pancakes, the unconditional love, was about to be examined, judged, and possibly dismantled by a legal system that had never been designed to understand a love as pure as a father's love for his daughter. The judge looked up. "Let the record show that we're here in the matter of Patricia and David Henderson versus Marcus Mitchell regarding custody of minor child Sarah Marie Mitchell. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" Marcus's lawyer stood. "We are, Your Honor." Patricia's lead attorney also stood. "Ready for the petitioners, Your Honor." And then it began. The battle that would change everything. The judge settled into his high-backed leather chair and looked down at the courtroom with an expression of measured neutrality. Judge James Henderson had presided over hundreds of custody cases in his 30 years on the bench. He'd seen families torn apart and rebuilt. He'd witnessed lies, desperate pleas, and heartbreaking truths. His face revealed nothing as he adjusted his glasses and prepared to begin the proceedings. "Before we start," Judge Henderson announced, "I want to inform everyone present that we will be following strict courtroom protocol. This is a custody hearing, and while emotions run high in such matters, I expect decorum and respect for this process. Are we clear?" He looked pointedly at both legal teams. "Yes, Your Honor," they responded in unison. Marcus felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead. He reached down and squeezed Sarah's hand gently, and she responded by leaning closer to him. His daughter was trembling. She didn't understand legal procedure, but she understood fear. She understood that her father was worried. Children were incredibly intuitive that way. They could sense the emotional undercurrents in a room like sharks could sense blood in water. Patricia's lead attorney, a man named George Blackwell, stood immediately. He was in his early 60s, with the bearing of someone who had won hundreds of cases. His suit was tailored perfectly, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Your Honor, if I may present our opening statement," he began, his tone confident and commanding. Judge Henderson nodded. "You may proceed, Mr. Blackwell." Blackwell walked to the center of the courtroom, his movements deliberate and practiced. He turned to face the judge, but his words were directed at everyone in the room, including the journalists in the back. This was theater, and he was a master performer. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today because the current custodial arrangement is fundamentally failing a child who deserves better. Sarah Mitchell is currently in the care of a single father who works approximately 60 to 70 hours per week. 60 to 70 hours, Your Honor. That means this child spends the majority of her waking hours with babysitters and daycare workers, strangers who have no biological or emotional investment in her well-being." Marcus felt his stomach drop. 60 to 70 hours. He'd actually worked those hours, yes, but Blackwell was framing it in a way that made him sound negligent, irresponsible. "The petitioners," Blackwell continued, gesturing toward Patricia and David, "are offering something far superior. They offer a stable two-parent household. They offer financial security. They offer time, attention, and the kind of family structure that child psychology research shows is optimal for child development. Mr. Mitchell has suffered a tragedy, the disappearance of his wife. We sympathize with that. But sympathy doesn't change facts. Sarah needs more than one exhausted parent. She needs the structure and stability that my clients are prepared to provide." He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in. "Furthermore, my clients have enrolled Sarah in a private school. They have a spacious home with a backyard where she can play safely. They have the resources to provide her with music lessons, athletic training, and cultural experiences. Can Mr. Mitchell offer the same? The evidence will show that he cannot." Linda stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory statements not supported by evidence." "Sustained," Judge Henderson said. "Mr. Blackwell, please confine yourself to facts and allow the evidence to speak for itself." But the damage was already done. The judge had heard the narrative. Sarah was being neglected. Her father was an absentee parent. Two parents were better than one. Money equaled better parenting. These were the seeds Blackwell had planted. The next 2 hours were brutal. Blackwell called witness after witness. First, Patricia herself, who testified in a measured, sympathetic voice about how much she loved Sarah. "I just want her to have the best possible childhood," she said, her voice catching slightly, as if fighting back tears. She spoke of Sarah being withdrawn at school, of behavioral issues, of a child clearly struggling in her current situation. Then came David, who testified about their spacious home, their financial stability, and their desire to be involved parents. "I coach Sarah's soccer team," he said. "I'm there every practice, every game. I'm involved in her education in ways that her father simply cannot be." Marcus wanted to stand up and shout. He went to Sarah's soccer games when he could. He helped with homework every single night. He read to her before bed. But the courtroom seemed to be accepting David's testimony as gospel truth. Then came a child psychologist hired by Patricia's legal team. Dr. Catherine Hayes was an expert witness, someone with credentials and authority. She testified about the importance of two-parent households, citing studies and research. She spoke about how children with single parents showed higher rates of anxiety and behavioral problems. She never mentioned Sarah specifically, but the implication was clear. Sarah was probably messed up because of her family situation. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Hayes concluded, "this child would benefit tremendously from the stability of a two-parent household with adequate financial resources." Marcus and Linda exchanged worried glances. Their own expert witness, a psychologist named Dr. Michael Torres, was scheduled to testify later, but he would be going second. In the court of public opinion, and the courtroom was full of observers, the first impression often stuck. Then came Sarah's current teacher, Mrs. Peterson. Marcus had hoped she would speak positively about Sarah, about how bright and well-adjusted she was. But Patricia's lawyers had clearly prepared her carefully. She testified that Sarah was sometimes withdrawn and occasionally had difficulty focusing in class. Were these things true? Partially. But every 5-year-old had trouble focusing sometimes. Every child was withdrawn occasionally. Mrs. Peterson's testimony made it sound like Sarah was barely holding it together emotionally. Sarah, sitting beside Marcus, began to cry softly. "Daddy, am I broken?" she whispered. The question pierced Marcus's heart like an arrow. "No, baby, you're perfect. You're absolutely perfect." But could the judge hear him? Could anyone? The attack continued relentlessly. Blackwell presented documentation of Marcus's long work hours, timesheets from his supervisor, records of overtime payments. He presented evidence of the daycare expenses, implying that Marcus couldn't even afford proper childcare. He presented Sarah's school records, noting that her academic performance was below average for her grade level. Marcus knew the truth. Sarah was smart as a whip. She was struggling in school because of the stress of this custody battle, because she was worried about being taken away from him. But that nuance wasn't being presented. The narrative was being constructed carefully, brick by brick, into a wall that separated him from his daughter. When it was time for a recess, Marcus pulled Sarah aside. "Listen to me," he said, kneeling down to her eye level. "Everything they're saying in that courtroom, it's not about you being bad or wrong. Do you understand? This is about grown-up stuff. You're the most perfect little girl in the world. I love you more than anything. More than my job, more than money, more than anything. Do you believe me?" Sarah nodded through her tears, but Marcus could see the doubt in her eyes. How could he compete with lawyers, expert witnesses, and financial resources? How could love, unconditional and pure as it was, stand up against the machinery of the legal system? As they walked back into the courtroom for the afternoon session, Marcus felt like a boxer going into round 2, already badly beaten, facing an opponent who hadn't even thrown their best punches yet. The ambush wasn't over. It was just beginning. After the lunch break, the momentum had shifted decisively. The morning's testimony had created a narrative that seemed almost insurmountable. Marcus Mitchell was a well-meaning but negligent single father, unable to provide the stability and resources that a child deserved. The courtroom felt heavier somehow, as if the air itself had grown thick with judgment. Linda squeezed Marcus's shoulder as they prepared for the afternoon session. "We're going to call you to testify," she said quietly. "I know you're nervous, but you need to be authentic. The judge has heard a lot of statistics and expert opinions. He needs to hear from you. He needs to understand your story, your love for Sarah, and why you're the right parent for her." Marcus nodded, but his mouth was dry. He'd never been in a courtroom before, never testified under oath. The idea of standing in front of a judge, in front of Patricia, in front of journalists, and trying to explain his love for his daughter felt impossible. How do you quantify love in legal terms? How do you measure devotion? How do you prove that you're a good parent when the opposing counsel has spent an entire morning convincing everyone that you're not? Sarah squeezed his hand. "Will they take me away, Daddy?" The question gutted him. "No, baby, I promise. Daddy's fighting for you." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. Judge Henderson reconvened the session at 1:30 p.m. The courtroom was fuller than before. Word had spread that this was an interesting case, and more reporters had arrived. Rachel Webb, the journalist Marcus recognized, was now sitting with a camera operator. This wasn't just a local story anymore. Something about it was resonating with people. "The petitioners have concluded their presentation," Judge Henderson announced. "We will now hear from the respondent. Mr. Mitchell, you will testify first." Linda stood. "Your Honor, we call Marcus Mitchell to the stand." Marcus stood on shaking legs and approached the witness stand. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. His palm was sweating. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. Patricia was watching with a calculating expression. David looked almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. And Sarah was watching her father with an intensity that broke his heart. Linda began with softball questions. "Mr. Mitchell, tell us about your relationship with your daughter." Marcus took a deep breath. "Sarah is my life. When Jennifer disappeared, Sarah was only 3 years old. She didn't understand what had happened. She just knew her mother was gone. I had to be both parents to her. I had to be strong for her even when I was falling apart inside. Every decision I make thinking about her. Every hour I work for her. I love her more than anything in this world." His voice cracked slightly and he cleared his throat. He meant every word. "Can you tell us about your daily routine with Sarah?" Linda continued. "I wake her up at 6 in the morning. We have breakfast together. I make her eggs and toast. I do her hair, usually braids because she likes them. I walk her to the bus stop. In the afternoon, I pick her up from daycare at 5:30. We go home and I help her with homework. We have dinner together, something I cook. After dinner, we play or read books. I put her to bed at 8 p.m. and I read to her every single night. I know all of her favorite stories by heart. On weekends, we do activities together. The park, the library, soccer, I'm there. I'm always there for her." It sounded good, but Marcus knew it paled in comparison to the comfortable house with a backyard that Patricia and David could offer. Then George Blackwell stood for cross-examination. The shift was immediate and brutal. "Mr. Mitchell," Blackwell began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you claim to be so involved in your daughter's life, yet you work 60 to 70 hours per week. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" "I work those hours because I have to," Marcus said. "I'm a single parent. I need to provide for Sarah." "But couldn't my clients provide more resources with less stress on you? Couldn't Sarah benefit from having parents who don't have to work such long hours?" "Sarah doesn't need money," Marcus said, his frustration rising. "She needs her father. She needs to know that I love her." "Yet you leave her with babysitters," Blackwell said coldly. "Strangers. How is that better than leaving her with her aunt and uncle who are family?" "Because I'm her parent," Marcus said, his voice rising. The judge shot him a warning look and he forced himself to calm down. "I'm sorry, Your Honor." But Blackwell had already won that round. He'd provoked Marcus into an emotional outburst, which would likely make him look unstable to the judge. Blackwell continued his assault for the next hour. He questioned Marcus about his finances, pointing out that his income put him barely above the poverty line for a family of 2. He questioned his work history, suggesting instability. He questioned his parenting decisions, everything from Sarah's diet to her bedtime to her academic performance. Every answer Marcus gave seemed to be twisted into something negative. "Mr. Mitchell," Blackwell said near the end of his cross-examination, "is it true that Sarah has been in 3 different daycare facilities in the past 2 years?" "Yes, but—" 3 different facilities. Doesn't that suggest instability in her life?" "I changed facilities because I wanted to find the best care for her," Marcus said. "I took her to different places until I found somewhere she was happy and thriving." "Or you couldn't afford to keep her in the same place, and you were forced to move her around repeatedly," Blackwell countered. "Isn't that a more accurate characterization?" Linda objected, but the damage was done. By the time Marcus stepped down from the witness stand, he felt demolished. He tried his best, but Blackwell had taken every word and twisted it into something damaging. Then came Linda's expert witness, Dr. Michael Torres, a child psychologist who testified about the importance of parental attachment and the research showing that quality of parenting, not quantity of financial resources, was the primary predictor of childhood well-being. He spoke about how children thrive with involved, loving parents, regardless of socioeconomic status. But by then, the courtroom narrative had already been established. Marcus was the struggling single father. Patricia and David were the stable, affluent couple offering a child a better life. The expert testimony in Marcus's favor felt like a whisper against a roaring storm. Sarah had cried through most of the afternoon. At one point, Marcus had to excuse himself to take her to the bathroom because she'd gotten sick, actual physical nausea from the stress. A 5-year-old child was being made physically ill by a legal proceeding about her own life. When Linda called Marcus aside during the late afternoon break, her expression was grim. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said quietly. "The judge seems sympathetic to Patricia's case. The testimony about your work hours is damaging. The fact that you've struggled financially is being used against you. We need something, some kind of moment or revelation, that reminds the judge why you matter to Sarah. Right now, the case is looking bad." Marcus felt his heart sink. "What do you mean, looking bad? I'm her father, I love her. Isn't that supposed to be enough?" "In an ideal world, yes," Linda said. "But in this courtroom with this judge, love is abstract. Numbers are concrete. Patricia and David have money. They have time. They have a bigger house. All of those things are concrete. Your love for Sarah, as real and powerful as it is harder to quantify in legal terms." Sarah was sitting on the bench behind them, swinging her legs and looking small and terrified. She'd heard everything. She understood that her father was losing. As the afternoon session continued, Marcus felt something breaking inside him. Not anger, not exactly. It was something worse, despair. The realization that the legal system, despite all its talk of protecting children's best interests, was actually designed to favor the wealthy, the stable, the people who could hire the best lawyers and present the most convincing narrative. He looked at his daughter and all he could think was, "I'm going to lose her. Despite everything I do, everything I am, I'm going to lose her." By the end of the day, as Judge Henderson announced that the hearing would continue the next morning, Marcus felt hollowed out. He held Sarah close as they left the courtroom, and she clung to him like she was afraid he might disappear. "I want to go home with you," she whispered. "I know, baby. I know," he said, not daring to promise anything he couldn't guarantee. That night, neither of them slept much. The second day of the custody hearing began even more grimly than the first. Marcus had barely slept. He kept replaying Blackwell's cross-examination in his mind, hearing the cold logic of the attack, understanding exactly how his love for his daughter had been systematically dismantled into legal liability. He dressed Sarah in the same pink dress. She'd requested it specifically, wanting consistency in at least one thing. They arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to resume. The morning air was cold, and Sarah clung to her father's hand like it was a lifeline. In many ways, it was. Linda was already there, looking as exhausted as Marcus felt. "I have some strategies for today," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We'll bring character witnesses, Mrs. Chen from the neighbor next door, maybe someone from Sarah's school who can speak positively about her." But Marcus barely heard her. He was numb, operating on autopilot. The case was lost. He could feel it in his bones. Everything yesterday had gone wrong, and he didn't see how today would be any different. They climbed the stairs to the courtroom again, each step feeling like they were walking toward an execution. Inside, Patricia and David were already seated, speaking quietly with George Blackwell. They looked confident, almost relaxed. Why wouldn't they? They were winning. The judge still hadn't arrived, so the courtroom was in that strange pre-proceeding state of quietness mixed with nervous energy. Journalists were setting up cameras in the back. The court reporter was arranging her materials. Bailiffs moved efficiently through the space, preparing for the day's proceedings. At 8:55 a.m., the courtroom doors opened again. A man in a dark blue police uniform entered, but what caught everyone's attention immediately was the dog beside him. It was a German shepherd, massive, muscular, noble-looking, with alert ears and intelligent brown eyes. The dog wore an official police vest, marking it as a working K9. The man was Officer James Chen, a police officer in his early 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. The courtroom murmured. What was a police dog doing in a custody hearing? Officer Chen approached the bailiff. "Good morning. I'm Officer James Chen from the police department. I'm here for the community awareness program that was scheduled with the judge. Is this still the right time?" The bailiff consulted his clipboard. "Yes, officer. Judge Henderson approved this earlier in the week. You can wait over there." He pointed to a seat near the judge's bench, away from the main proceedings but still visible. Officer Chen nodded and guided Duke to the designated spot. The dog was perfectly behaved, moving with the discipline of extensive training. He sat quietly, his head alert but calm. He was clearly accustomed to courtroom environments, or at least, he was accustomed to remaining composed in any situation. But something happened that nobody predicted. Sarah's eyes locked onto Duke the moment the dog entered the courtroom. Her entire body went rigid. It wasn't fear, it was something else entirely. It was like recognition, like she'd suddenly seen something her soul had been searching for. Her small eyes widened and she gripped her father's arm. Marcus noticed immediately. "What's wrong, baby?" he whispered. "The doggy," Sarah breathed, her voice barely audible. "Look at the doggy, Daddy." Marcus looked at the dog, then back at his daughter. She was transfixed. Her small face, which had been drawn and anxious since the hearing began, was suddenly alight with something, wonder, maybe, or hope, or both. "That's a police dog," Marcus explained quietly. "A K9, they help police officers." But Sarah wasn't listening to the explanation. She was simply staring at Duke with an intensity that seemed to transcend her fear of the courtroom, the legal proceedings, even the threat of being taken away from her father. It was as if the presence of this magnificent creature had activated something in her, a reminder that beauty and nobility still existed in a world that had recently felt very dark. Officer Chen took his seat, and Duke lay down beside him in a perfect, downstay position. The dog's eyes remained alert, scanning the courtroom with the awareness of a professional. But as he rested, his presence seemed to settle the room somehow. There was something calming about the dog's demeanor, something that made the harsh edges of the courtroom feel slightly less sharp. Judge Henderson arrived at 9:00 a.m. sharp. He reviewed his notes briefly, then looked up at Officer Chen. "Officer, thank you for being here. Your community awareness program is scheduled for later this morning, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Officer Chen replied respectfully. "Duke and I won't interfere with the proceedings. We're just here to observe and then conduct our program during the break." "Very well," Judge Henderson said. "We will proceed with the hearing. Let the record show that Officer James Chen and K9 Duke are present in the courtroom as part of a community police awareness initiative." The proceeding resumed, but Sarah's attention was divided. Blackwell called another witness, one of Sarah's neighbors who testified that he'd sometimes heard Sarah crying, which Blackwell interpreted as emotional distress stemming from Marcus's inadequate parenting. Linda's questions tried to reframe it as normal childhood emotions, but the narrative was already established. Then Linda called her character witnesses. A teacher from Sarah's school spoke about how bright Sarah was, how creative, how loving. Mrs. Chen, the neighbor from the apartment below, testified that Marcus was a devoted father who was always putting Sarah first. But these testimonies felt like whispers against the roaring storm of yesterday's case. Throughout it all, Sarah's eyes kept drifting to Duke. The dog lay calmly beside Officer Chen, occasionally shifting his position but otherwise remaining perfectly still. He seemed to sense, somehow, the tension in the room. His very presence was grounding, stabilizing. This was a creature of strength and loyalty, of purpose and devotion. He represented everything good about the bond between a protector and a dependent, which was precisely what the courtroom was trying to evaluate. At around 10:30 a.m., during a brief procedural pause, Sarah leaned close to her father. "Daddy, I want to see the dog," she whispered. "I know, baby," Marcus said gently. "But we have to wait. The judge is working right now." Sarah squirmed in her seat, her small body radiating an anxiety of a different kind now. Not the existential terror of losing her father, but the simple, desperate desire of a 5-year-old who wanted to pet a beautiful dog. It was almost a relief, Marcus thought. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about custody battles or legal arguments. She was just thinking about a dog. As the morning wore on, Sarah became increasingly restless. She kept looking toward Duke, her small face showing signs of genuine distress at the separation. It was the most vulnerable Marcus had ever seen her in the courtroom, vulnerable in a childlike way, not the adult way she'd been forced to be vulnerable yesterday. At one point, Sarah tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy, why is the dog sad?" "Is the dog sad?" Marcus asked. "He looks lonely," Sarah said seriously. "He needs someone to talk to him." Marcus looked at Duke, then back at his daughter. In her 5-year-old wisdom, she'd recognized something true. The dog, despite being trained and professional, did have a certain isolation about him, separated from everyone in the courtroom, forced to sit quietly while humans engaged in human dramas. It was at that moment that something shifted in Sarah. She stood up on the bench, her small frame visible above the wooden back. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at her, curious about what the child was doing. "I want to talk to the doggy," she called out, her voice cutting through the formal proceedings with the pure, unfiltered emotion of childhood. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Henderson looked down at the small girl standing on the bench, her pink dress bright against the dark wood, her blonde hair falling from its braids slightly, her face flushed with emotion. He didn't immediately reprimand her. Instead, something unexpected happened. A small, genuine smile appeared on Judge Henderson's face. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present before, "I think we could all use a brief recess. Officer Chen, would you mind if we allowed the young lady to say hello to your partner?" Officer Chen looked surprised but immediately stood. "Of course, Your Honor. Duke is very gentle with children." And in that moment, everything changed. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as Judge Henderson made his ruling. This was highly irregular, allowing a child to interact with a K-9 during legal proceedings. But something in the judge's expression suggested he understood that what was about to happen was more important than courtroom protocol. He was a judge with 30 years of experience, and he'd learned that sometimes the most important truths couldn't be spoken in words. Officer Chen stood immediately, his face showing surprise at the judge's permission, but also a kind of understanding. He'd been a police officer long enough to recognize that his dogs sometimes accomplished things that human words couldn't. "Of course, Your Honor. Duke is an extremely gentle dog. He's wonderful with children." Marcus remained frozen in his seat. He wasn't sure what was happening. Was this good? Could it help? Or was it just a momentary distraction before the legal machinery continued to crush him? Sarah, however, didn't hesitate. She scrambled down from the bench with the urgency of a child who'd been given permission to do something she desperately wanted. Her small pink shoes clicked against the courtroom floor as she ran toward Officer Chen and Duke. Several people in the gallery gasped. It wasn't every day you saw a child break from the formal structure of a courtroom proceeding. Officer Chen knelt down to Sarah's level as she approached. "Hi there, little one. What's your name?" "I'm Sarah," she said breathlessly. "What's the doggy's name?" "This is Duke," Officer Chen said warmly. "He's a police dog. He helps me do my job. Would you like to pet him?" Sarah nodded so vigorously that her hair braids swung. Officer Chen guided her hand toward Duke's head. "You can pet him right here on his back or his sides, very gently." Duke remained perfectly still as Sarah's small hand made contact with his fur. The moment their skin met, something shifted in the courtroom. It was subtle but palpable, a collective awareness that they were witnessing something genuine, something pure, something that transcended the legal arguments and expert testimony that had filled the courtroom for the past day and a half. Sarah's entire face transformed. Her expression, which had been drawn and anxious for the past 36 hours, suddenly lit up with pure joy. Her fear melted away. She ran her small hands through Duke's fur, exploring the texture, the warmth, the realness of this magnificent creature. "He's so beautiful," she whispered almost reverently. "He is," Officer Chen agreed. "And he likes you too, see. His tail is wagging." Indeed, Duke's tail was moving back and forth in slow, gentle movements. The dog seemed to understand that he was interacting with a child in distress, and he was responding with the kind of unconditional acceptance that only animals could provide. No judgment, no lawyers, no evidence to present, just presence. Sarah moved closer, pressing herself against Duke's side. The dog, with the discipline of extensive training, remained perfectly still, allowing this small human to lean against him, to wrap her arms around his neck, to anchor herself to something stable and real. And then something remarkable happened. Sarah began to cry. Not the scared, suppressed crying of a frightened child in a courtroom. These were deep, shaking sobs, the kind that release years of tension and fear. Her small shoulders heaved as she clung to Duke, and the dog, incredibly, adjusted his position slightly to make himself more comfortable for her, allowing her to lean more fully against him. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Henderson's stern expression had softened considerably. He was watching this scene unfold with an intensity that suggested he was witnessing something far more important than any legal argument. Linda had her hand over her mouth, tears forming in her own eyes. Even some of the court reporters were visibly affected. Rachel Webb, the journalist, was frantically gesturing to her camera operator, making sure they were recording this moment. This wasn't just a custody hearing anymore. This was something elemental, something that spoke to the human condition in a way that few things could. Sarah's father, Marcus, sat in his seat, unable to move, watching his daughter find comfort in the presence of a dog. His eyes were filled with tears. He understood suddenly that this moment, this unplanned, unexpected moment, might be more important than anything his lawyer could have orchestrated. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Patricia's expression had changed. She was no longer confident. She was watching a small child, her niece, sobbing against a police dog, and something in that image seemed to shake her. Her lawyer, George Blackwell, was frowning, his mind clearly working through how to address this development. Officer Chen remained quietly present, his hand gently on Duke's back, letting the dog do what he did best, provide unconditional love and acceptance to someone who needed it desperately. For nearly 3 minutes, Sarah simply held on to Duke, crying without restraint. The boy's presence seemed to give her permission to finally feel everything she'd been suppressing: the fear, the confusion, the loss of her mother, the terror of losing her father, the weight of being the subject of a custody battle that she didn't understand but desperately wanted to end. Duke didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply accepted the child's tears and fear and love with the kind of grace that only a dog trained for trauma work could manage. Gradually, Sarah's crying subsided. Her breathing became more regular. She kept her arms around Duke's neck but pulled back enough to look into his eyes. The dog gazed back at her, and for a moment, it seemed like they understood each other completely, two souls communicating in a language that transcended human words. "You're so good," Sarah whispered to the dog. "You're so good and so beautiful and so strong." Officer Chen looked at Judge Henderson. The judge nodded slightly, as if giving permission for this moment to continue for as long as it needed to. Sarah released her grip on Duke slightly and began to notice the rest of the courtroom. Her eyes swept across the faces of everyone present: the judge, the lawyers, the journalists, her father. She seemed to realize suddenly that everyone was watching her. She became self-conscious, her small hand still resting on Duke's back. "Is the doggy, is he happy?" she asked Officer Chen. "Yes," Officer Chen said. "Duke is very happy, and I think he likes you very much. Sometimes animals can tell when someone needs their help. I think Duke knew that you needed a friend right now." Sarah nodded solemnly, absorbing this information. She looked back at Duke. "You helped me," she said simply. "Thank you, Duke." The dog's tail wagged again, as if in acknowledgement. At that moment, Judge Henderson cleared his throat. "Officer Chen, thank you for allowing this interruption. I believe we've had enough of a recess." He paused, his eyes lingering on Sarah. "Young lady, you may return to your seat now." Sarah stood slowly, her hand trailing along Duke's back as she moved away from him. She was reluctant to leave, but she understood that the judge had spoken. Officer Chen guided her back toward her father's seat. As she passed her father, Marcus couldn't help himself. He reached out and pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly. Sarah climbed into his lap, suddenly small again, suddenly vulnerable in a different way, vulnerable in the way that only a child who has just been through an emotional experience can be. The entire courtroom seemed to have been transformed by what they'd just witnessed. The energy was different now. The coldness of legal argument had been replaced by something warmer, something more human. Judge Henderson looked back at Officer Chen. "Thank you, officer, that was enlightening." Officer Chen nodded respectfully and guided Duke back to their designated spot. The dog lay down, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained on Sarah, as if checking on her, making sure she was okay. The judge looked at the lawyers on both sides. "We will resume the hearing," he announced. "But I believe we've all been reminded of something important today. Let's continue." As George Blackwell stood to continue his questioning, something had shifted in the courtroom. The narrative had changed. The question was no longer whether Marcus was a good enough parent in purely practical terms. The question had become something more fundamental. What did Sarah actually need? And everyone in that courtroom had just witnessed, in the most profound way possible, what Sarah needed. She needed her father. The courtroom had resumed its formal proceedings, but the energy was fundamentally different. George Blackwell stood, consulting his notes, clearly trying to regain the momentum that his case had possessed just minutes earlier. But something had shifted in the room, an almost palpable change in the atmosphere that no lawyer could fully control or reverse. Sarah sat in her father's lap, her small body still trembling slightly from her emotional release. Marcus's arms wrapped around her protectively, his chin resting gently on her hair. For the first time since the custody hearing began, he felt like they were a unit again, like their bond was unbreakable despite everything. Blackwell cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if we may return to the substantive issues at hand, I'd like to revisit the testimony regarding." But Sarah suddenly lifted her head. She wasn't looking at the lawyer. She was looking at Officer Chen and Duke, who were seated near the judge's bench. Her small face was serious, contemplative, as if she'd been thinking deeply about something during her emotional moment with the dog. "Daddy," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her recent tears, "can I say something?" Marcus looked down at his daughter, uncertain. He glanced at Linda, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, baby, what do you want to say?" Sarah turned toward the judge. Her small voice, which moments ago had been racked with sobs, now carried a kind of certainty that seemed impossible for a 5-year-old to possess. "Judge," she said, her pronunciation of the title careful and deliberate, "can I talk?" The entire courtroom went absolutely silent. Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly, his stern judicial expression softening. "Yes, Sarah, you may speak. What would you like to tell me?" Sarah took a deep breath. She glanced at Officer Chen and Duke, then back at the judge. What she said next would be repeated in news broadcasts, printed in articles, and discussed in legal circles for years to come, not because it was legally sophisticated, but because it was profoundly true. "Officer Chen loves Duke," Sarah said simply. Her voice was small but audible in the silent courtroom. "He takes care of him, he protects him. He makes sure Duke is safe and happy. Duke knows that Officer Chen loves him." Judge Henderson was listening intently. Patricia had stiffened slightly. Blackwell looked confused, unsure where a 5-year-old statement was going. Sarah continued, her childlike logic unfolding with devastating clarity. My daddy loves me like Officer Chen loves Duke. He takes care of me. He protects me. He makes sure I'm safe and happy. I know my daddy loves me. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs when truth has been spoken so purely, so directly, that everyone in the room understands they've witnessed something transcendent. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. He couldn't speak. He could only hold his daughter and marvel at her wisdom. But Sarah wasn't finished. She looked directly at her Aunt Patricia, her 5-year-old eyes meeting those of the woman who wanted to take her away. I don't want to leave my daddy, she said. I want to stay with him. He's my person, like Duke is Officer Chen's person. Several people in the courtroom began to cry openly. One of the jurors, there were no jury members but court observers, had her hand over her mouth. Rachel Webb, the journalist, was frantically writing notes. Her camera operator was capturing every moment. George Blackwell stood frozen, his legal arsenal suddenly useless against the articulation of a child's essential truth. All his arguments about work hours and financial resources, all his expert testimony about two-parent households, all his evidence and documentation suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of what Sarah had just said. Judge Henderson had removed his glasses. He was rubbing his eyes, visibly emotional, his judicial composure cracking in response to the pure authenticity of a child's love for her father. Linda had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Beside her, Marcus was openly sobbing, still holding his daughter close, understanding that this moment, this unplanned, unexpected moment, had just changed everything. Officer Chen was watching with quiet understanding. He'd seen his dog accomplish many things, but this was something rare and profound. Duke had somehow provided the catalyst for a child to speak her deepest truth. Patricia looked at her lawyer, uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. She'd wanted to take her niece, but seeing Sarah so clearly state her love for her father, so definitively choose her father, seemed to be breaking something in her resolve. She looked away, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. The court reporter's hands had stopped moving. She was too moved to continue transcribing. The judge looked at her gently. "Please, continue recording the proceeding," he said softly. Sarah, having said what needed to be said, simply settled back into her father's lap, seemingly unaware of the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished. She was a child again, not a legal argument or a case file or a custody dispute. She was simply a little girl who loved her father and had finally been given the opportunity to say so. Judge Henderson put his glasses back on and looked at both legal teams. His expression had transformed. Where there had been judicial neutrality before, there was now something that looked remarkably like clarity. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying new authority, "that we've heard the most important testimony of this entire proceeding." Blackwell attempted to regain control. "Your Honor, with all respect, a 5-year-old child's emotional statement cannot override the documented evidence." But Judge Henderson held up his hand. "Mr. Blackwell, I have 30 years of experience on the bench. I have presided over hundreds of custody cases. I have reviewed countless documents, heard countless expert witnesses, and read countless psychological evaluations. But I have never heard anything more persuasive than what I just heard from that child." He paused, looking at Sarah, then at Marcus, then at Patricia. "A child's love for a parent," he continued, "is perhaps the most fundamental truth in human experience. It cannot be manufactured. It cannot be faked. It cannot be purchased with a larger house or financial resources. It simply is, or it isn't. And what I have just witnessed is a child expressing her fundamental need for her father in language more clear and powerful than any legal argument this courtroom could produce." Patricia was now openly crying. David looked down, his confident demeanor completely shattered. Blackwell tried once more. "Your Honor, I must protest. This is highly irregular. A child's emotional state cannot determine a legal outcome." But the judge was shaking his head. "What I have witnessed, Mr. Blackwell, is not an emotional outburst. What I have witnessed is a child articulating a profound truth about the nature of love and protection. That is not irregular. That is justice clarifying itself." The courtroom seemed to exhale. The battle that had raged for 2 days, the legal assault on Marcus's character, the evidence against him, the testimony designed to prove his inadequacy, suddenly felt insignificant in the face of Sarah's simple declaration. Linda reached over and squeezed Marcus's shoulder. Even she, an experienced attorney, understood that something extraordinary had just occurred. No legal strategy could have orchestrated this moment. No lawyer could have written a statement more powerful than what a 5-year-old had just articulated. Sarah looked up at her father. "Daddy, are we going home?" Marcus, unable to speak, simply nodded and kissed the top of her head. Judge Henderson looked at the court. "We will take a recess. When we reconvene, I will issue my ruling." He paused and added, "And Mr. Blackwell, I would advise you to seriously consider whether continuing this case is in anyone's best interest, particularly your client's best interest." As the judge stood and left the bench, the courtroom erupted in a kind of controlled chaos. Journalists rushed toward the back, eager to file their stories. Court observers whispered to each other, all of them aware they just witnessed something rare, a moment when legal proceedings met human truth and truth had won. Marcus held his daughter close, and Sarah clung to him with all the strength a 5-year-old possessed. Officer Chen remained quietly in his seat, Duke resting peacefully beside him. The dog had fulfilled his purpose, not by performing any trick or demonstrating any training, but simply by being present, by receiving Sarah's pain and fear, and by reminding everyone in that courtroom what love actually looked like. The recess lasted 30 minutes, but in those 30 minutes, everything changed irrevocably. The moment Judge Henderson left the bench, the courtroom transformed from a formal legal proceeding into something more like a human drama unfolding in real time. Journalists surrounded Rachel Webb, asking her what she'd captured on camera. "That was the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed in a courtroom," she said, her voice still shaking with emotion. Her camera operator replayed portions of Sarah's statement, and everyone who watched it felt the same thing, a profound shift in understanding about what truly mattered. In a smaller anteroom off the main courtroom, Patricia sat with her lawyer and her husband. George Blackwell was frantically trying to salvage the case, discussing appellate strategies and how to respond to the judge's comments. But Patricia wasn't listening. She was staring at her hands, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "I can't do this." David looked at his wife in confusion. "What do you mean? We were winning." "Were we?" Patricia asked, her voice hollow. She looked up at her lawyer. "Did you see that child? Did you see how she loves her father? How could I possibly try to take her away from that?" Blackwell attempted to refocus her. "Patricia, emotions are running high. Once the judge issues his ruling, we can discuss appeals. The law doesn't care about feelings. It cares about the best interests of the child, and we have documented evidence." "Stop," Patricia said, holding up her hand. "I don't want to hear it anymore. I came here thinking I was saving my niece. I thought Marcus was failing her, that she needed us, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." She looked at her lawyer with resignation. "I want to drop the case." Blackwell's face went pale. "Patricia, you can't be serious. We're in the middle of proceedings." "I'm serious," Patricia said. She stood up, her body language suggesting a woman who'd finally made peace with something. "When Judge Henderson reconvenes, I want you to tell him that we're withdrawing our petition for custody. I was wrong to file it in the first place." David stared at his wife. "But we've spent so much money on this. We've built this entire case." "At what cost?" Patricia interrupted. "At the cost of my relationship with my brother-in-law, at the cost of traumatizing a child, at the cost of separating a father and daughter who love each other. I don't care about the money. I don't care about winning. I care about doing the right thing. And the right thing is to let Marcus keep his daughter." Blackwell made one more attempt. "If you do this, you may be liable for court costs. The other side could file motions for attorney fees." "Fine," Patricia said. "Send me the bill. I deserve it. Now please, when the judge comes back, tell him we're done." Back in the courtroom, Marcus sat with Sarah in his lap, both of them waiting for the judge to return. Linda was conferring with her paralegal, preparing for what she believed would be the judge's ruling. A ruling that, thanks to Sarah's statement, seemed likely to go in their favor. Marcus looked down at his daughter, who was playing quietly with a small doll she'd brought to the courtroom. She seemed unaware that she'd just fundamentally altered the course of her own life. She was simply a child, existing in the present moment, content to be with her father. "You did really good today," Marcus whispered to her. "Do you know that?" Sarah looked up at him. "I just told the truth," she said simply. "I know, baby, and that was perfect." Officer Chen approached Marcus quietly. "Your daughter is remarkable," he said. "In all my years as a police officer, I've rarely witnessed something as powerful as what she just expressed." Marcus stood and shook the officer's hand. "Thank you for being here. I don't know how to explain it, but Duke helped her find her voice." Officer Chen smiled and glanced at his dog. "That's what Duke does. He helps people find what they need to say." At 2:45 p.m., Judge Henderson returned to the bench. The courtroom filled again, reporters and observers retaking their seats. The anticipation was palpable. Everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Judge Henderson settled into his chair and looked at both legal teams. "Before I issue my ruling, I understand that the petitioner's counsel has something to say." George Blackwell stood, his face showing clear embarrassment and defeat. "Your Honor, after careful consideration and consultation with my clients, we wish to withdraw our petition for custody. The petitioners no longer wish to pursue this case." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Henderson's eyebrows raised slightly. "Mr. Blackwell, is this a joint decision by both petitioners?" "It is, Your Honor," Blackwell confirmed. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. Patricia was looking at the floor, tears streaming down her face. David had his arm around her, his earlier confidence completely gone. Judge Henderson nodded slowly. "Very well. The court accepts the withdrawal of the petition." He paused, then added, "I will note in the record that while the petitioner's withdrawal spares this court from issuing a formal ruling, it is abundantly clear what such a ruling would have been." He looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Mitchell, it is the finding of this court that you are a devoted and capable parent. The love between you and your daughter is evident, undeniable, and precisely what a child requires for healthy development." Then he looked at Sarah. "And to you, young lady, I want to say that you have taught this entire courtroom something invaluable today. You reminded us that beneath all of our legal arguments and documentation and procedure, there is something far more important, the bond between a parent and child. Thank you for that lesson." Sarah didn't fully understand what the judge was saying, but she understood one thing: she didn't have to leave her daddy. The courtroom erupted. People stood and applauded, an extremely unusual occurrence in a courthouse. Journalists rushed toward the exits, eager to file their stories. Court observers hugged each other, moved by the outcome. Judge Henderson banged his gavel. "Order, order in the courtroom." But even he seemed to be suppressing a smile. Marcus picked up Sarah and held her high, tears streaming down his face. She wrapped her arms around his neck. "We're staying together?" she asked. "We're staying together," Marcus confirmed. "Forever and ever." Linda hugged both of them, her professional demeanor completely abandoned in the face of genuine human joy. "We did it," she said. "You did it, both of you." Patricia stood and looked at Marcus from across the courtroom. Their eyes met. She nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, of apology, of understanding. Marcus nodded back. There would be time for conversation later, perhaps for forgiveness and reconciliation. But for now, they both understood that the right outcome had occurred. Officer Chen led Duke toward the courtroom exit, but Sarah called out, "Duke, thank you, Duke." The dog paused and looked back at the little girl, his tail wagging. Officer Chen smiled and gave the dog a gentle tug forward. "Come on, boy, let's go home." As Officer Chen and Duke left the courtroom, Rachel Webb caught up with him in the hallway. "Officer, can I ask you a few questions about this case?" Officer Chen smiled warmly. "I'd be happy to help, but I want to be clear about something. Duke didn't do anything extraordinary today. He was simply being himself, present, accepting, loyal. It was that little girl who did something extraordinary. She spoke her truth. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything." Back in the courtroom, as Marcus carried Sarah out, he passed the judge's bench. Judge Henderson was still in his chair, watching them leave with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge called out gently, "take care of that daughter of yours." "I will," Marcus said, "every single day for the rest of my life." As they walked down the courthouse hallway, Marcus held Sarah in his arms, and she held him close. The legal battle was over. They had won not because of superior arguments or better documentation, but because a 5-year-old girl had simply told the truth about love. The sun was beginning to set as Marcus and Sarah emerged from the courthouse. The day had transformed from the darkest nightmare into the most beautiful victory. The courthouse steps were filled with reporters, camera operators, and photographers, all eager to capture the moment when a father and daughter walked out together, their bond unbroken and their future secured. Rachel Webb approached Marcus with her camera operator. "Mr. Mitchell, could we get a statement? Your story is going to be broadcast on the evening news." Marcus wanted to tell them to leave him alone, to let him have this private moment with his daughter. But he also understood that the story, the real story of how Sarah's honest emotion had pierced through legal formality, deserved to be told. He stopped and turned to face the camera. "I just want to say thank you," he began, his voice still emotional. "Thank you to my lawyer, Linda Rodriguez, who believed in me. Thank you to Judge Henderson, who was wise enough to listen to what really matters. And thank you to my daughter, who had the courage to speak her truth." He paused, looking down at Sarah, who was holding his hand. "This case isn't really about custody or finances or two-parent households versus single-parent households. It's about love. It's about the fact that a child knows who loves her, and that love transcends every legal argument and financial consideration in the world." "What about Officer Chen and Duke?" Rachel asked. "Do you think the dog's presence changed the outcome?" Marcus looked thoughtful. "I think Duke provided something that was missing from the courtroom: unconditional acceptance. He gave my daughter permission to feel everything she'd been holding inside. And sometimes, that's all a person needs to find their voice and speak their truth." As the reporters continued asking questions, Officer Chen appeared on the courthouse steps with Duke. When Sarah saw the dog, she immediately broke free from her father and ran toward them. "Duke," she called out, her voice filled with joy. Officer Chen knelt down as Sarah wrapped her arms around the dog's neck once more. This time, there were no tears, only gratitude and genuine happiness. Duke's tail wagged, and he pressed his head against the little girl, as if blessing her, as if confirming that everything was going to be okay. Marcus approached Officer Chen as his daughter hugged the dog. "I don't know how to thank you," he said simply. Officer Chen stood and shook Marcus's hand firmly. "You don't need to thank me. Duke and I were just here for a community program. Your daughter did the real work. She spoke her truth, and that changed everything. Still, Marcus insisted, if you and Duke hadn't been here, this might have gone a very different way. Officer Chen smiled and looked at Duke, who was allowing Sarah to scratch behind his ears. You know, I've worked in law enforcement for 30 years. I've seen a lot of human nature, the good and the bad. But what I've learned from my years with Duke is that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply being present. Being present, accepting people as they are and letting them be themselves. That's what Duke does. And that's what your daughter did in that courtroom. A journalist called out, "Officer Chen, do you think Duke should be hailed as a hero?" Officer Chen shook his head. Duke is a working dog. He's not a hero in any conventional sense. But Sarah, that little girl right there, she's the real hero. She had the courage to speak her truth in a room full of intimidating authority figures. That took more bravery than anything Duke could do. Sarah released Duke and looked up at Officer Chen seriously. "Will I see you and Duke again?" she asked. "I think you might," Officer Chen said. "My K-9 unit occasionally does community presentations at local schools. Maybe your school would like to have us visit." Sarah's face lit up. She looked at her father. "Can we, Daddy? Can they come to our school?" Marcus laughed, a real laugh that came from genuine happiness rather than the forced laughter of the past few days. "We'll see, sweetie. We'll talk to your school." As evening fell and the reporters eventually dispersed, Marcus sat on the courthouse steps with Sarah. Officer Chen and Duke had said goodbye and driven away, but the impact of their presence would linger forever. "Daddy, do you think Duke will remember me?" Sarah asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think Duke will remember you. Animals remember people who are real with them, people who are honest about their feelings. And you were very honest with Duke today." "I'm glad the judge let me see him," Sarah said. "I'm glad I got to hug him. I'm glad he helped me say what I needed to say." "Me too, baby, me too." Over the following weeks, the story spread far beyond the local news. Rachel Webb's report went viral on social media. News outlets across the country picked it up, the story of a tiny girl, a police dog, and a father fighting for custody of his daughter. But more than that, it was the story of how a child's honest emotion had revealed a deeper truth than any legal argument could provide. Academic papers were written about the case. Legal scholars discussed Judge Henderson's implicit ruling about the limitations of documentary evidence when confronted with authentic human truth. Child psychologists cited Sarah's behavior as an example of how children naturally express what adults often suppress or complicate. But more importantly, the case sparked a broader conversation about custody law in America. How much weight should be given to financial resources versus emotional connection? How much should the legal system privilege two-parent households over single parents? What does best interests of the child actually mean when a child herself makes clear what she needs? Judge Henderson received thousands of letters from single parents who felt validated in their struggles, from judges struggling with similar cases, from regular people who saw in Sarah's story a reminder of what truly mattered in life. Patricia, in a remarkable gesture of genuine reconciliation, contacted Marcus 3 weeks after the hearing. She asked to take Sarah out for ice cream, and they spent an afternoon together, not as adversaries, but as two people who cared about Sarah trying to repair what had been broken. "I was so wrong," Patricia told Marcus as they sat in the park while Sarah played on the grass nearby. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was saving my niece from a difficult situation, but I was the one who didn't understand what she actually needed." Marcus listened, and eventually he forgave her. He understood that she'd come from a place of love, however misguided. And Sarah, with the resilience of childhood, was able to accept her aunt's presence in her life again. Exactly 1 year after the custody hearing, Sarah started kindergarten. On her first day of school, she talked about nothing but her hope that Officer Chen and Duke might visit her class for the K-9 community program. She'd been thinking about that promise for an entire year. When Officer Chen and Duke finally arrived at her school 3 months later, Sarah was the most animated she'd ever been. She led the dog around her classroom, introducing him to her friends, proudly telling them, "This is Duke. He helped me when I needed help. He's the reason my daddy gets to keep me." The other children were fascinated by the dog, petting him and asking questions. But to Officer Chen, watching Sarah interact with her classmates, confident, happy, secure in her father's love, was the greatest reward Duke could ever receive. After the demonstration, a school counselor approached Officer Chen in the hallway. "That little girl," she said, "do you know her story?" "Yes," Officer Chen said, "I do. She's remarkable." "What you and your dog did for her was incredible," the counselor said. Officer Chen smiled and shook his head gently. "We didn't do anything extraordinary. We were simply present. The girl did the extraordinary work by speaking her truth. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world, one person being honest about what they really need." Years later, when Sarah was older, she would tell people the story of the custody hearing and the police dog. She'd explain how she'd been terrified, how the legal proceedings had seemed like something beyond her control, how she'd felt like a possession being fought over rather than a person with her own needs. But she'd also explain how seeing Duke had given her permission to feel everything she'd been suppressing. And speaking her truth, that simple, childlike articulation of love, had changed everything. As for Marcus, he carried the memory of his victory not as a moment of triumph over Patricia, but as a moment when the system worked as it should, when love was recognized as more important than financial resources, when a child's authentic voice was heard and honored, when justice aligned with what was truly right. The story of the tiny girl who pointed at the police dog became more than a custody case. It became a symbol of how truth, honesty, and authentic emotion can overcome even the most complex legal arguments. It became a reminder that in a world full of complexity and procedure, sometimes the simplest truths, a child's love for her father, a dog's unconditional acceptance, a moment of human honesty, are the most powerful forces we possess. And every time Sarah saw a police car with a K-9 unit, she would smile and think of Duke, and think of the day when being truly honest about her love had changed her entire life. The end.